Hello, welcome to 8.9 News. I'm Costain. It had been assumed that phosphates, particularly from agriculture, were the primary cause of algal blooms in the rivers Wye and Usk. However, research has found a more complex web of factors that impact the river's health. I spoke to Professor Rupert Perkins from Cardiff University's School of Earth and Environmental Sciences, and I asked him why people had blamed phosphates for the algal blooms in the first place.
So if you're old enough to remember the 1980s, 1990s, then back then we had a lot of instances of big algal blooms in reservoirs and lakes. These were cyanobacteria, often known as blue-green algae, and they produce toxins, and there was a lot of media attention and a lot of focus on trying to find out what the cause was. But back then, in those days, we were using a lot of detergents in domestic use and industrial use, which was very rich in phosphorus. So what we've done is basically released the cyanobacteria, the blue-green algae, from their limitation of that phosphorus. And so they had so much, they just bloomed and they caused the problems. What we then did, I say the royal we, but what was done was basically to try and reduce the amount of phosphorus in the system by better regulation and to remove it from domestic use so much and from industrial use so much. Obviously, it was still there from use in fertilizers, but we got the levels down a long way. So the problem is that we're now stuck in that mindset, which is now out of date, because we've got the phosphorus levels down much lower than they were in those days. So the problems we're getting now are a mixture of causes, not just the phosphorus that we saw as the big problem back in the 80s, 90s.
Are you able to give me a sense of the proportional difference between historic levels and the levels of phosphorus today?
So, for example, if we look at the River Wye, which is the river we've been working on, if you look at the special area conservation regulation levels, then the amount of phosphorus in the River Wye during the periods when we'd be expecting the problems of algal blooms, the phosphorus is actually below those regulatory levels. We very rarely get above those levels. If you go back to the 80s, 90s, it was, order of magnitude higher. So these days we're much lower. There are times when those phosphate levels do peak. That's when we get big rainfalls washing lots of nutrients into the river. But in general, most of those rainfall periods are outside of the summer period when we're most at risk from algal blooms. So we're usually below the levels of regulatory limits.
So the levels of phosphorus have come down, but the algal blooms are still happening. What did your research uncover?
Well, first of all, we didn't see a single algal bloom in the 2 years we studied the River Wye. We certainly saw what we call benthic diatoms, which are algae that grow on the bottom of the river. But in the actual water column, we didn't see any. That's not to say it didn't happen, because sometimes these can be only, say, 2 days in how long they last. But we were there every 2 weeks, right the way through the summer for 2 years, and we didn't see the cyanobacterial blooms. As I said, we measured the phosphorus and also other forms of phosphorus, not just phosphate, which is what usually gets measured. We measured all sorts of different fractions, as well as lots of nitrogen fractions and other nutrients, and flow rates, etc., and other variables. And in a nutshell, what we would say is that, yes, phosphorus is part of the jigsaw puzzle, but it's a small piece. The bigger pieces are the nitrogen fractions, probably ammonium and nitrate, and also climate change. The biggest problems in the river that we see are the low summer flow rates, the high temperatures in summer, and then the high pulses of river flows when we get these big extreme storms and high rainfalls in winter. So our conclusions are currently that it's a mixture of climate change through changes in flow rate. It's the temperature in summer, again, climate change, and also the nitrogen fractions.
And what are the main sources of the key pollutants?
So our current bit of research that we're analysing the data on now is we're able to actually source the nutrients back to where they came from by looking at different chemicals that associate with the nutrients. So watch this space for actual cause and of where it's coming from. But really, what we would say is what people already know is when it comes to nitrogen, the biggest sources in coming into the river are probably from fertilizer use and slurry.
And what impact is climate change having? You talked about the changes in the flow levels, but how is it accelerating the levels of pollution?
So it's not so much impacting on the pollution levels, and this is something we want to get people to think about the river in a different way and holistically look at the catchment and work as a team on a whole suite of different triggers that cause problems in the river. So the low, when we talk about the River Wye, we're often talking about the amount of salmon in the river, species like water crowfoot, the ranunculus species, and lots of other aspects of biology. Those biology aren't stressed just because of algae and nutrients. They're stressed because of high temperatures when the flow rates are low. And also, obviously, if you've got very low flow rates, that's not good for the salmon. It's not good for the plants as well. But then when you get these big pulses of rain, when you get the storms in autumn and the high rainfall over winter, that's washing a lot of sediment in, it's eroding the riverbed, it's smothering where you might get the water crowfoot growing. And as a result, we're putting too much stress holistically onto the river with the combination of these high and low flow rates and high and low temperatures. And the nutrients are obviously then part and parcel of this overall bigger picture of what we need to be looking at. What we're sort of saying to people is the longer we think about phosphorus as a sort of a silver bullet of trying to get the river better, the worse things are going to get because we're focusing on one thing, which is not the primary cause of the problem. We need to be looking far more wider at all the different things that are affecting the river and managing it at a catchment level.
So as with so many things, there's no simple solution, but a whole web of sources that are creating those impacts. Very interesting. The research for the Wye and Usk Foundation was carried out on the River Wye. Would you expect similar results on the River Usk?
Well, importantly, we haven't actually studied the River Usk, so we haven't measured the data ourselves, and I haven't seen data to analyse myself, so a bit of caution there. And also, if you talk to anybody who works on lakes, rivers, and reservoirs, they'll tell you that they all behave differently. That said, there are commonalities between them, and I would put my hand on my heart and say I'd be very, very surprised if the River Usk doesn't have similar causes of problems that are the same as the River Wye. So in the River Usk, I live only 4 miles away from the River Usk. I go there regularly. I'm a keen bird watcher. I walk along the river and I see those low flow rates in summer. I see the high flow rates in winter. I've seen citizen science data, which is an awesome source of information on both of these rivers. And I know the temperatures can be very high in summer. So there's certain similarities there, which I would guarantee must be playing an important part in the problems in the River Usk as well. Being a similar catchment, I would imagine that the nitrogen fractions are also similarly a problem. But again, we've improved the amount of phosphorus in the system, so it may be that phosphorus isn't quite so important as people maybe think in the Usk, as it isn't so important in the Wye as well. But without seeing the data, I couldn't confirm.
Based on your findings, what needs to happen next to improve river health, both in terms of research and societal change?
So I'd say for the research that we're doing, really it's a case of widening that research and getting a team of people together who are able to actually analyze the catchments of these rivers at a bigger scale. So when we're talking about trying to make things better, we're talking about more trees and buffer zones around the edges of the river. We're talking about changing the flow rates of water in the surrounding catchment before they get into the river. We're talking about trying to maintain a higher level of flow rate. So we need to research about how we're going to do that, as well as also studying the biology of the system more. So we use environmental DNA to study all the species that we can find in that river. The biology tells you so much because you've got all these variables like temperature and nitrogen and phosphorus, et cetera, et cetera. How they interact is very complicated, but the biology tells us basically how they're interacting. If we analyze the biology acts as an indicator of the river health for us. So if we can study the river more and measure more of the DNA in the river and tell you the full picture of all the species there, then that gives us a far better understanding of all the processes that we can work with for nature-based solutions to improve these rivers. So that's what I would say from the research point of view. On the wider societal levels, there's all sorts of different levels that you and I can contribute. So we need to conserve our water better. People are still looking at water and thinking of it as being a cheap, disposable resource, basically, and leaving taps running and things like that. We just got to get away from that aspect, so that river levels and abstraction from rivers is something that we can start to manage. And we need to think more holistically about how we use waste from farming and our own waste as well, and rethink the use of sewage and waste regarding recycling nutrients. That's another higher level as well. But really, I would say the first stage is getting the stakeholders, the managers, the regulators, the researchers all in the same room and saying, right, we need to manage this river holistically. We need to work together on the catchment, on the buffer zones, as I said earlier on, and the trees around the edge of the rivers, the flow rates through the farmers' fields and elsewhere, and the drainage coming off the roads, etc. We need to be thinking about how we're going to buffer the impacts upon the river regarding changes in flow rate and temperature and those nutrients that are getting in there as well, because it's a combination of the environmental variables, our use of the catchment and how we manage it, and the nutrients all coming together. And if we just focus on one of those, we're never going to do anything about it.
That was Professor Rupert Perkins from Cardiff University. More news as ever on our website 8.9.com. That's all for now. We're back soon. Thanks for watching.